トビデオ
In the most distant of human history's distant past, the whole of humanity had one language, one common speech. As mankind journeyed from the east, they found a rich, fertile plain in the land of Shinar. They then said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly. Let us build ourselves a city, and a tower whose top is in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth." And so a great tower was erected from the city they had built. For generations upon generations, more bricks were baked and added to the tower. It grew and grew and grew until it could almost touch the heavens. But the Lord of all creation, Yahweh, came down from on high and bore witness to the great city and soaring tower. They realized that humanity, united through one language and culture, were limitless in their possibilities. They then declared, in an echo of humanity, "Come, let us go down and confuse their language, that they may not understand one another's speech." And with that, the Lord scattered humanity across the face of all earth, giving them new languages and cultures so that they may never surpass them, their Creator. Compared to the other stories like the fall of man, the Great Flood, and the story of Abraham, the Tower of Babel's story is a relatively small part of the book of Genesis. Situated in chapter 11, the story only consists of 9 verses out of 31, with the rest being devoted to genealogical begats. But it is still important because it is the last of the origin myths of the Bible, acting as both an etiology explaining the origins of multiplicity of languages and customs, and a parable about humanity's collective humbling for our arrogance in believing we could surpass God. Obviously, the Tower of Babel is not a historical account, but it's a myth with many possible origins. Some have theorized that the story drew from similar creation myths found in Sumerian and Assyrian civilizations. Others have argued that the story is a metaphor for the city of Babylon, which had a massive ziggurat named Etemenanki dedicated to the god Marduk in the city. Either way, the Tower of Babel myth has persisted throughout our cultural history, sometimes connecting it through humanity's depth of language or through architectural feats. But a lot of the time, people use the Tower of Babel as a secular metaphor for technology going too far. Despite the literal act of God, humanity still possesses the capabilities and desire to surpass them. And once humanity builds a new figurative tower through technological advancement, could that also be our undoing? Anyways, let's talk about Patlabor. Three years ago, I talked about the history behind one of the anime industry's most successful yet seemingly unsung franchises of the late 80s, Patlabor. The product of a small artist collective Headgear, which consisted of mangaka Masami Yuki, mech designer Yutaka Izubuchi, character designer Akemi Takada, screenwriter Kazunori Ito, and, most importantly, director Mamarou Oshii, Patlabor brought a fresh new take on the then massively popular mecha genre. The narrative focused around the Ragtag Special Vehicle Section 2, Division 2 of the Tokyo Metropolitan Police, combating crimes and terrorism with their special robots called Patrol Labors, or Patlabors for short. The appeal of the franchise can be found in how it approached the mecha genre. It took the concept of giant robots and removed them from larger-than-life superhero narratives and dramatic space operas and placed them on Earth in the near future, reducing the concept of the giant robot to a vehicle one performs day-to-day operations in. Even when encountering bank robbers, environmental terrorists, and Godzilla, the focus always was on the sheer mundanity that came with the police procedural.
お前たちが乗車しとるのはグレートマジンガーか弾劾王か自閉症児や不良少年が主人公のロボットアニメじゃないんだよ。
In short, Patlabor's appeal was that it made giant robots boring in the best possible way. This was the recipe for a runaway success, especially during a time where producers were beginning to cast doubt on the OVA formats. And do you know what happens when a brand new franchise like that gets successful? They get a movie. a lone scientist hidden in the shadows stands on the precipice of a large metallic structure. His colleagues beg him to reconsider what he's about to do, but their pleas fall on deaf ears as he casually strolls off the edge, and as he falls into the waves far below, he smiles. We cut to a forest sometime later. Scores of military units have been called in to deal with a specific problem. A giant spider tank has run amok. Luckily, the heavily armed laborers are able to bring it to a standstill, but when the officers check the cockpit to see who is inside, they find nothing. Now we cut to our heroes of the second unit, Azuma and Noah. They are en route to the Ark, a brand new labor manufacturing facility built as part of the Babylon project to keep up with its demands. They are there to escort their superior, Captain Nagamo, back to base. Nagamo had just spent the day testing a new prototype Patlabor called the Type 0. Its big selling point is that it is the new Patlabor that comes pre-installed with the new Labor Core System program, the Hyper Operating System, or HOS.
従来の機体に乗せ替えるだけでも 30% は性能が上がるって画期的なやつ。ハイパーオペレーティングシステム HOS。
Back at base, we learn that the second unit has been working their tail feathers off to make up for the work of the first unit, who are all off receiving training on the Type 0. And one of their newfound duties is corralling and bringing out-of-control laborers under their control. It turns out the incident with the tank at the beginning was not an isolated incident. Over the past month or so, there has been a massive spike in similar incidents involving laborers going berserk. To cut back on both the incidents and the extensive collateral damage caused by Officer Oda, Azuma decides to take it on himself to get to the root of the matter and figure out what is going on with the laborers, especially since both the manufacturers and the police are trying to sweep the issue under the rug.
プログラムの暴走による事故はありえないってのが本庁とメーカーの一致した見解だからな。ま、乗員の操作ミス、人為的事故って線で蹴りだな。
We soon learn that there is a connection between the berserk laborers and the brand new operating system. Now Azuma really finds himself wanting to get involved since the HOS was the product of Shinohara Heavy Industries, his estranged father's business. Meanwhile, Commander Goto has decided to also do his own detective work and has his friend Detective Matsui search for the lead programmer of the HOS, Eiichi Hoba, the same man we saw fall into the sea at the beginning. And it's not before long that the out-of-control laborers, the HOS, and Eiichi Hoba are connected into a grand scheme that will soon threaten the very fabric of labor-driven society.
つまりだ、暴走事故がプログラムのバグの結果でなく、意図的にプログラムされたものだとしたら、と言っとるんだよ。
1989's Patlabor the Movie is an incredible blockbuster anime film, a true last hurrah of 80s bubble era cinema. It's a thoughtful techno thriller revolving around solving a mystery where the answer never seems to get close. It's also an audacious giant robot action film where the crew of the future production IG are pouring their blood, sweat, and tears to bring the collective vision of Headgear to cinema screens everywhere. Despite being at the front of the line though, the first Patlabor movie also feels incredibly under-discussed, a factor we can partially ascribe to it being trapped in the shadows of its successor. But even when it came out, it was the victim of constant downplaying, including by its own creators. Yutaka Izubuchi said, "In some ways, the first Patlabor movie was intended as nothing more ambitious than a work of mere entertainment," while director Mamarou Oshii has described the movie as just a proper pop entertainment movie. They're technically correct. Patlabor the movie is certainly more of a crowd pleaser than what would come next, but to say it is just that is underselling it if you ask me. This is still Oshii directing a Kazunori Ito script, so there are still big ideas in its themes and direction it grapples with, and I want to bring them to light. So get your mini disc out and try to copy down what I'm about to say. The instantaneous popularity of the Patlabor OVA release stirred up interest in continuing the franchise, and it was decided almost immediately that the next entry would be theatrical. But what really kicked off the project was the spark that inspires creators of all stripes. Money. According to producer Taro Maki, Patlabor the movie began when he went over to Mamarou Oshii and told him, "Hey, in order for us to pay you and the rest of the Headgear royalties, we need you guys to make a film." From the stories floating around about this production, it sounded like Oshii was not so crazy about making Patlabor the movie, especially so soon after production on the OVA wrapped. Plus, there's a lot of conflicting details about how the idea of the movie's story came into being. According to Kazunori Ito, Oshii had been reluctant to make the film. That was until a fateful car ride when inspiration struck Oshii and he got the idea of what the movie was going to be about then and there. All they had to do afterwards was fill in the framework they had created. Oshii, however, tells a different story. He said, after working on the early days, he was forbidden from working on the set any longer by an unnamed producer and assumed Patlabor was over. That was until another producer, Shin Unozawa, came up to him and encouraged him to sign on for the movie, saying that the film version would be an opportunity to do a final fireworks display for Patlabor. The real story could either be a mixture of these two, or they're all just lying, but regardless, a film was going to happen, and Oshii and the rest of Headgear were in no position to turn down potential money. Also, since the OVA project did start as a potential pilot film series for an abandoned TV project, producer Onizawa was interested in revisiting those plans for a series again. But when he approached the idea to Headgear, Oshii put his foot down saying, a television series would wear out the staff, so I want to do a movie version first. When the film was being made, Headgear made 3 promises for what the fans should expect from the movie. First, to follow the royal road of entertainment, whatever that means. Second, to give major roles to Ozma and Noah, who were the main characters but had little to do in the OVA. And third, to depict a labor versus labor battle. We'll see how those promises play out later, but you should know beforehand that Oshii said of the 3 promises, I had heard about the vow, but once I started making the film, I forgot everything. But while funding for the film was secured, production was very stressful. Not only did Headgear have to contend with the strict budget they were given, but they were also given a strict deadline for a July 15th release. According to Oshii, he was only able to get the entire storyboards for the movie done by locking himself alone in a hotel room. And all of this was not helped by Headgear producing the bonus episode for the OVA, Go North SV2, at the same time as a way to tide people over until the movie. When the final cut of the film was shown to the producers, one of them said that they didn't really understand what the plot was about, but they also remarked that the action in the movie reminded them of last year's Gundam movie, Char's Counterattack, which is what they really wanted out of their Patlabor movie. So, mission accomplished?
It's a film.
Blockbuster is the correct way to describe Patlabor the movie because it really feels huge in a way the OVA did not. While the OVA definitely did have the advantage of being given a bubble era OVA budgets, the movie goes one step beyond all of that. Despite the tight deadlines, Headgear knows that they have to push themselves to make this look more cinematic than it did on home video, which was already plenty cinematic. One choice they did was tweak the character and mecha designs to have them look slightly more realistic. Under the guiding hand of animation director Kazuchika Kisei, the character drawings in the film diverged from Akemi Takada's more comic designs. They were given smaller eyes and shadows around the mouth and under the cheeks to give them a more realistic feel. This feel is also extended to the character animation. They act in a very human way, which makes the scenes where it's just 2 or 3 characters talking, which is half the film, look interesting. They scratch their heads, lean against windowsills, fiddle with their drinks. It feels proper actorly. The character acting also serves to tell the audience who these characters are, even if you didn't watch the OVA beforehand. For example, in the scene where we finally got the entire second unit in a room together, they're all crammed in and bitching about the extra work coming their way. All except for Oda, who, even before he opens his mouth and says they should be grateful for how their fight against evildoers is not impeded by trivial workers' rights,
俺たちの人権は誰が守ってくれんだよ。
そんなものはない
is passionately lifting super light dumbbells in the corner, illustrating both his pursuit for an exaggerated hypermasculine ideal and how much of a joke he is. Oshii's blocking also helps make this feel like a cinematic outing. So much of the movie's conversational scenes and montages are elevated by how he frames the shots, symmetrical blocking, characters talking side by side, high angle shots, even utilizing reflections in windows and mirrors. And it wouldn't be an Oshii movie if it didn't have a fisheye lens shot, used to great effect in this scene of Ozma and the Chief chewing each other out.
そんなバカな。じゃあ篠原重工の責任はどうなるんです。俺だけ処分された向こうはお咎めなしなんて喧嘩両成敗ってのが筋ってもんでしょうが。
貴様、警察を一体何だと心得てる。捜査活動は親子喧嘩の手段ではない。
偉そうなこと言いやがって。自分たちだって真相を知りながら
上司の許可も得ず勝手に捜査
活動
活動を行う
を裏
など
取引しやがった
言語道断。
Even with the designs leaning more into realism though, that still does little to prevent some Urusei Yatsura-esque comedic animation from leaking into the frames. Most of it comes from Oda's exaggerated facial features when fighting/failing, but then you have scenes like this where the hungry support crew descends on Izumi-chan carrying a batch of Hiromi's farm-fresh tomatoes. It's such a quick moment of goofy comedic animation, but it gets a laugh out of me. And we can't forget the action animation that greatly impressed the producers. Actually, that would be underselling it because it implies that the action is just dumb spectacle. No, real thought was put into these. The smooth descent of the paratroopers, the first-person camera shot of Apaches firing missiles, and the flash of bullets fired by labors ripping through the chassis of other labors. For keeping action grounded in reality, the animators still find ways to make it flashy. They make Noah getting out of Alphonse and reloading her revolver tense and exciting. Though if anybody talks about anything technical-wise in this movie, it's of the long montage scenes where Detective Matsui and his assistants are walking through the abandoned derelict parts of Tokyo, tracking down Eiichi Hoba's last known addresses. Not only do these parts silently help peel back layers of the mystery, but they also immerse us into the near-future world of Patlabor through the artistry of art director Hiromasa Ogura. Wanting to portray a near-future Tokyo more strongly, the Headgear team did scouting trips in downtown Tokyo, taking pictures of all the best locations they could find. Using these photos as reference, Ogura and the rest of the artists painstakingly drew the world of Patlabor, allowing the audience to take in a world where the future is being constructed at the expense of the past. The art direction also helps place the setting in time. It's not explicitly stated in the movie, but you can feel that it takes place in the dead heat of summer, which also ends up as a subtle bit of foreshadowing for how the climax will go down. Headgear getting a hand-drawn movie that looks this well constructed out in such a brief time frame is no mere feat, obviously, but we have seen on the show that similar productions can and will sacrifice story for spectacle. Does Headgear avoid such a pitfall? For 2/3 of the runtime, Patlabor the movie is a methodical techno thriller, devoted to Ozma, with a little hands-off help from Goto and Matsui, trying to piece together what exactly is making the labors run haywire. The conflict within this portion of the film comes not just from solving a mystery, but Ozma also having to do so while navigating the police bureaucracy. The foundation of the Patlabor franchise is the mundanity of police work and the red tape involved, and even in a crowd-pleasing blockbuster, that hasn't gone away. What prompts Ozma to take the case on is him noticing a pattern with similar incidents involving berserk labors, but Goto informing him he can't file that information in his report because the brass and manufacturers have already issued a joint statement, saying that the cause was operator error, which is suspicious.
被疑者である乗員と札付きのエバー隊員の証言だけじゃ警察は動きはしないよ。
So Ozma must move within the parameters of the police force in his investigation so not to arouse the attention of his superiors. Old Man Sakaki, the head of engineering, is going to Shinohara Heavy Manufacturing on business. I better tag along to ensure his safety. Oh, would you look at that? I found a copy of the HOS master code and discovered it's actually a virus. Of course, even with operating under procedure, Ozma does slip up and get caught through those procedures. At the halfway point, Ozma decides to treat Noah to dinner, but that's actually a cover for him to report his findings to her. But that outing earns him a 2-week suspension because he went AWOL while on watch, while also riding his moped without a helmet, which has the cascading effect of his superiors getting wise to his unauthorized investigations.
含む規定からの甚だしい逸脱として懲罰にかけるべきところを時期が時期でもあるし後藤隊長の嘆願を入れて穏便な処置にとどめたのだ。不出来な部下といえども身を挺してかばう彼の温情に感謝したまえ。
They also nail Ozma for the fact that he's too close to the case. Shinohara Heavy Manufacturing is his old man's business, and while Ozma is estranged from his father and can't reach him, he does have a personal stake in finding out the cause for the labor's maladies.
俺は じっちゃんの口からこのことを公表してもらいたいんだ。レイバーを悪役にしちゃいけないよ。そうだろう。
But Ozma is not the only one working on the case. Thankfully, since that saves his bacon. Commander Goto is also interested in finding out the cause of the labor problems. He does this through handing the investigation footwork to his friend Matsui, as well as through Ozma's investigation. It's established pretty early on that Ozma is able to get as far as he does in his detective work thanks to Goto giving him clearances as well as nudging him in the right direction.
相変わらず人を乗せて使うのがお上手だこと。
He also was the one who ratted him out to the brass, all for the sake of allowing him to focus on the investigation more as he's suspended.
泉に吐かせて俺が垂れ込んだ。
隊長！
お前疲れてたろ？これで現場を離れてそれこそ捜査に専念できるじゃないの。
So what are Ozma's findings? AG Hoba's HOS program has been inserting virus code into every labor where it is installed on. The code causes the labors to go wild and attack people when a certain trigger is activated. And that trigger? The wind. The wind passes over certain buildings and bridges built in a way that they act like giant whistles and air harps, causing them to emit low-frequency sounds. Sounds that cannot be heard by humans, but can be picked up by labor sensors.
なんだ？
何か聞こえるんだよ。犬の耳には人間には聞こえない音も聞こえるんだって。どこかで風が鳴ってるんじゃないかな。
But that sound still only reaches laborers in a limited perimeter. For a plan this complicated, there has to be some greater plot to it. It turns out, all the labor incidents so far have been trial runs. The Ark in Tokyo Bay is also an ideal building for emitting low-frequency sounds through winds, but only if they are at high enough speeds. So, if a typhoon hits, that would cause a chain reaction to cause at least 8,000 labors to go haywire. And guess what's on the Weather Channel?
明後日未明には東京湾へ上陸する模様です。気圧は950ミリバール。中心から半径20キロ以内は風速40メートル以上の暴風圏に入ります。
Remember, both the SDF and the second unit had trouble with one labor running wild. Imagine the destruction a couple thousand of them would cause. And even if all the labors had been downgraded to the previous OS, the risk that the HOS installation itself implanted a dormant virus is too much. Therefore, if they want to prevent disaster from striking, the only way to do so is to have the second unit storm the Ark and tear it down. This being due to their IT guy Shige choosing not to install HOS because, like any good tech person, he's suspicious of any new OS at launch.
いやー、向こうでホスがやばいって分かった時はやったーと思ったね。これも親父さんの日頃の教育の賜物よ。いくら便利なもんでも素性の知れない OS を乗っける気になれなくてさ。
It also helps that the Typhoon will be the perfect cover for their operation, the ultimate uninstall of Windows 11. So now we get to the third act of the movie, which is the big crowd-pleasing action movie that it sold itself on. After spending most of the movie focused on Ozma and Goto, now the rest of the second unit can finally get their moment to shine. And since this is the big moment for the fans, we also get the return of a favorite character.
Sightseeing?
No. Combat.
She's back, folks! Kanika Clancy is back in Japan and is here to open up a can of whoop-ass on this army of possessed construction equipment. And from this point forward, we get 30 whole minutes of non-stop action. As the second unit shoots their way through infected labors, each one of them seems to get their moment to shine. Azuma and Mikiyasu acting as hackers running against the clock. The normally gentle Hiromi lugging and shooting a gun as big as he is. Even Ulta is a little bit more competent than he usually is as he puts in the work. They accomplish the mission, tearing down the Ark in a big spectacular fashion. Mission complete. Let's all go hump sight. Oshii really did forget about the promise, which in turn made him forget about giving Noa Izumi a proper role in the narrative. By his admission, he said he found himself unable to really write and be attracted to a young bright-eyed cutie like Noa, which gives us insight as to why Nagamo has more of a presence in this film than her. But since Noah is the main character, she has to have something to do aside from getting the menfolk snacks, so she gets to fight the final duel against the Type 0. I should mention that the only reason why the Type 0 is online in the first place is because Clancy stupidly decided to activate it for more firepower despite knowing it running on the Hoss.
例のウイルスを分離したシステムよ。うまくいけばコントロールできるかもしれない。
しかしどこかに残留していたら
放っておいてもこれは脅威になるわ。それに太田の2号機だけではそこを支えきれない。
You'll be sorry!
And since Oshii hates Clancy, he got to effectively sideline her while also giving Noah a proper moment in the spotlight. Two birds meet one stone. The fight itself is really well animated. It's a duel between the old and new model of giant robots, with the tension coming from both parties having to keep their balance on a crumbling platform. But it doesn't prevent it from feeling shoehorned in after such a dramatic climax happened just a few minutes earlier. But Noah gets to save the day in the end, so all's well that ends well. We get our happy crowd-pleasing ending with our allies of justice saving Tokyo from certain doom. But wait a minute. I think we forgot something. Apart from that brief scene at the very beginning, the main antagonist Eiichi Hoba is not seen throughout the film. He exists merely as a name, a shadow that spreads across the narrative. He is the lone agent behind every conflict within the movie, and he cannot be brought to justice because he has already deliberately taken himself out of the equation. Part of the mystery that Azuma and Goto are trying to peel back is why exactly did Hoba set all of this up? They don't have much to go on because Hoba scrubbed most of his records. The only real lead they have are his residential records, which is what the Matsui sections are all about, going through every house Hoba ever lived in right up to the one he was born in. We do find out how Hoba came up with the idea of using the nearby skyscrapers in his plots, but never a true motive. Matsui and his deputy only find empty bird cages and encrypted Bible verses. Slim pickings. There's even some suggestion that Hoba could still be alive in all this. It's emphasized that his body was never found. And sure enough, at the climax, Noah gets a reading that Eiichi Hoba's ID tag is active on top of the Ark's control center. She ascends to the top, armed and ready for a big confrontation, and only finds a flock of birds, one of them holding Eiichi Hoba's ID tag. He's dead, and that's all he ever will be. A critique I've heard leveled at this movie is that Eiichi Hoba is too mysterious an antagonist. We don't have anything solid to go on figuring out who he was and why he's carrying out this plot in the first place. We are just as in the dark as the police are. This was an idea from Oshii, and he actually faced some resistance over it. Kazunori Ito said that Hoba's absence throughout the movie would raise the level of the film, but it would confuse the audience. So it might be up to the audience to figure out the mystery of Hoba's motives. And I'm pretty sure we can find all the clues in the religious motifs seen throughout the film.
A Hoba? Sounds like Jehovah.
Christian motifs in Japanese media are nothing new, but they rarely have any larger meaning other than it looks cool. But with Oshii, I feel like we are meant to apply a deeper reading to their presence. After all, he did do an entire OVA film that was nothing but biblical references. In fact, like Angel's Egg, Oshii did apply concepts to the film that he hoped to implement in that loop on the third film he never got to do. Namely, the plot being centered around a mad architect building a Tower of Babel in the heart of Tokyo and then jumping off after its completion. The setting of Patlabor revolves around the massive Tokyo land development project called the Babylon Project, that's only made possible through the power of laborers. The goal of the project is to reclaim Tokyo Bay for real estate development using artificial islands, and the newly founded centerpiece of the project is the Ark, the labor production facility that hopes to get the project ahead of its 10-year goal. But as we see throughout the franchise, the Babylon Project comes at great cost. In the OVA series, we see the environmental and political impacts that come from it, but for the movie, we see the larger societal impact. A lot of the old neighborhoods and suburbs of Tokyo are being abandoned and demolished for the sake of the project. And it's remarked that it's similar to the then current real estate boom Japan was going through in the 80s, the past being erased for the sake of the future.
あの辺りは80年代の土地狂乱の頃、地上げで壊滅した町の一部でね、その後の国土法の制定やら何やらで、結局活用されずに、いわば宙に浮いてた土地だったんだそうだ。
From seeing where he lived all his life, Hoba had a front row seat to all this demolition in the name of progress. And this explains why he carried out his plan. He wanted to act like God, to punish people for their arrogance in trying to build beyond their capabilities. He wanted to bring humanity back to normal. If it brought wide-scale destruction in its wake, so be it. It genuinely would have been scary if Hoba's plan did succeed. It's not just going to be construction laborers affected by this change.
湾岸および都内の再開発地区はもちろんのこと、地下1000メートルのジオフロント作業区、さらに一部の原発の炉心部でもレーバーは稼働中であります。
The narrative does sympathize with Hoba's goal. It wasn't just him feeling like he was being left behind. The idea that technology is moving too fast for anyone to keep up with it is a rub that's felt by a lot of our heroes. Sakaki talks about how the younger generation looks up to him as the wise old master, but they have genuinely surpassed him in so many areas without even knowing it.
車両整備の神様なんぞとおだて上げられちゃいるが、ソフトに関しちゃ素人も同然。うちのシゲや若い奴らにはとてもかなわねえ。
You could draw a comparison to the current AI hype cycle that's going on right now. There's a massive push for it, even though it will put tons of people out of work and make jobs redundant. But unlike AI, which is built on overvalued media hype from Silicon Valley tech bros, the labors have proven to be a net positive for humanity. They have increased productivity and have made a lot of jobs more valuable to keep around. Society has rewritten its rules around labors because they have been such a boon for mankind. Even with the rise of labor-based crimes as we've seen in the OVAs, the positives clearly outweigh the negatives. Turning the public against the labors would be like trying to turn people against computers. Even if it was successful, it would result in a vast sea change for society. In trying to recreate the Tower of Babel for the modern world, Hoba would not return the world to the pre-labor era. He would instead usher forth a new chaotic future where humanity would have to find a new technology to replace the labors. He would turn the future into the past that would be paved over by a new future. He would fail, unless that was his plan all along.
我々はどこへ行くのか、我々は何者なのか。
なんだいそりゃ。
大昔ヨーロッパに攻め込んで破壊の限りを尽くした野蛮人の隊長が壁に書いた文句。
Let's go down and confuse their speech indeed. Now, after all that babbling is done, how do we conclude this? While we don't have the box office or sales numbers for it, it's clear that Patlabor the movie was a huge success to follow up the OVA with, because we got more Patlabor in its wake. But would I personally recommend Patlabor the movie? Yes, very much so. It's way more of a crowd pleaser than one would normally expect from an Oshii helm project. It's the only U of the Patlabor franchise. But unlike Only You, where it was a for the fans experience to a fault, Patlabor the movie strikes an amazing balance between the heady philosophizing and religious imagery and the big, loud action set pieces. Even if Oshii was carrying a lot of reluctance in helping produce this, some of which can be felt on screen, I don't think it affects the film in too negative a fashion. The final product is all you could ever want and need out of a Patlabor movie. With how well it holds up, it's a piece of the past that could never be paved over by the future. Thank you all for watching. If you like this video or want to support this channel, please donate to my Patreon. Each dollar can give you early access to my videos as they come out, as well as keep the channel running a bit more smoothly. You can also subscribe to the channel, ring that bell for notifications, or just like this video. Either way, you'll be helping me out. That's all for now. See you for the next round of tapes.